Hello, I'm Mikhail Henning. I get asked oftentimes what's the difference between an inventory audit and inventory forensics. And although they're very similar, they're very quite distinctly different at the same time. I was very fortunate enough to be involved in a joint investigation with the United States Navy and the Department of Health and Human Services, where we analyzed over 10,000 credit card transactions. These transactions were for things as small as an office product all the way to a $1.3 million CAT scan machine. So I'm very fortunate enough to be working alongside some of the most brilliant minds that I believe that there ever were doing this type of investigation. But an inventory audit usually revolves around something called the Sarbanes-Oxley. There are 4 key areas that it's looking at to make sure that your physical count of goods matches your financial records. Violations can be issued upon you, and the worst of all, having your FCC filing suspended to where you can no longer trade on the stock exchange. Where an inventory forensics is still looking at the same things, but then it's going a step further, looking at all the transactions behind those transactions, the thought process that went into it, and it's really more an investigation to get legal filing or legal evidence for a court proceeding. Now, these can be anywhere from an abuse of power or abuse of financial records. I'm going to go over 2 different examples that I've come across over the years on both those sides of the coin. Let's look at a company. It was $170 million in annual revenues. They were in business for 38 years. They were acquired by a private equity firm, and that equity firm did an audit. They passed the SOX audit, the Sarbanes-Oxley, the SOX, but they wanted to know a little more behind why they had a leakage of $1.3 million, which was 0.76% of their sales. Below 1%, but again, this is a recently acquired company. They wanted to find out more, so they hired me to come in, do a gap analysis, kind of restructure a little bit, and let them know what I found. So as I started to do the investigation, a couple more things fell into place. So again, they passed the SOX audit, so their inventory audit was successful. But now we get into the inventory forensics. So not only did we have a leakage rate of $1.3 million, we had something called the employee guarantee. The customer guarantee. So a customer would buy a product. If they didn't like that product, they were allowed to return that product. Now the company couldn't resell that product back onto the marketplace, but they could go through a wholesaler. So that's an additional $1.2 million on top of the 1.3 of leakage that we started to look at because things didn't quite add up there with the number of wholesalers that they were doing business with in some of those transactions. Then we started looking at their vendor damage or defect credit, which was 3%. So if the company bought product, they were allowed to say, hey, 3% of this is damaged, whether it comes from overseas or across the country. And so vendor A would resupply 3% of product to our customer to resupply. And that turned out to be $2.7 million. So we were over $6 million in our scope of the investigation when we just started looking at the $1.3 million of leakage. What we found out was that there was an elaborate scheme from 17 employees all the way from the warehouse to the buyers who were manipulating the numbers, reporting falsely that they had damaged product. So they were basically fraudulently reporting to the vendor, so they were defrauding their vendors to our customer. So these 17 people all were joint owners of a retail outlet in Fresno, California. Fresno, California was about 200 miles outside of the range of our customer's territory. They were a regional customer, but it was still isolated to the California Bay Area. So Fresno was 200 miles outside or 200 miles from their nearest store to that area. So that way it was, they weren't a breach of the customer profile or the customer geographics. So, and it was really sad because the CEO of this company had been there for 37 years, great gentleman. When the company was acquired by the private equity, that's when they made him the CEO. He was completely oblivious to what was going on. He wasn't prosecuted, but he was forced to resign. That's the difference there between an audit and forensics. Again, they passed the SOX audit. Now let's look at another example. Globally, this company was doing about $3 billion in sales. At the site level that we were looking at, they were doing around $130 million in sales. Specifically, we're looking at the overages of inventory or the excess, the E&O, right? Excess and obsolete inventory, E&O, which was over $4 million, which is quite excessive. They were booking about $42 million of inventory. Really, a company this size should have been running closer to $26 million of turnover. So as we started looking into it, we started finding, wait a minute. So these E&O products are the same part numbers that we've already sold off. So what's going on? So again, this company was fantastic. They had a great auditing system. They passed the SOX every time. But as we started digging into it, we started realizing that, okay, so what we found out in the investigation was they had a manager came in. They hired a manager from out of the country, came in from Mexico on a work visa. He wanted to do a great job, very smart individual, but he ended up making a mistake. He wanted to make a name for himself. So he took the $1.2 million of the excess and obsolete, the E&O, and he sold it to another division overseas that still made that product. Say like customer L no longer made a product in the States, they made it overseas. So we gathered together $1.2 million of materials. We sold it to, let's call it Plant U. So Plant H sold to Plant U $1.2 million. Problem is this manager did it all on himself rather than incorporating the help of the actual team, because what he should have done was take the products off of the MRP. So when he moved the materials over to Plant U, the MRP reran, said, hey, you're missing this $1.2 million of material. It automatically sent POs to the vendors and it resupplied the 1.2. So they moved 1.2 overseas and then they brought the 1.2 right back into the warehouse. Now this manager, it was an honest mistake and we could have worked through it, but now we get a little more into abuse of power. So what the manager did was he had buyers and planners create work orders from customer L. And then he had those work orders canceled. So it looked like customer L placed $1.2 million worth of orders and then canceled those orders. Now the material is no longer showing as E&O because there's been recent demand in the system for it. So now that material is moved from E&O, it was moved over to MTO. Now it gets really more into the abuse of power because now this manager laid off the buyers and planners that he had hide his $1.2 million mistake. And he actually replaced those buyers and planners with the ones that he brought in from Mexico from the last company that he was working at. So that's the difference between an audit and a forensics. An audit can pass SOX. It's making sure that your physical count of goods matches your financials. Where forensics goes a little bit deeper, follows the breadcrumb, peels back the onion, and gathers all the information for legal proceedings.